39 bodies, all dressed in identical black uniforms and Nike's faces covered. It's an image seared into our collective memory, the tragic end of the Heaven's Gate cult in 1997. But what led these seemingly ordinary people to such an extreme end? You might think you know the story. Trust me.
There's a lot more to unpack here.
Yeah, there really is.
You're right. This isn't just about a comet and a mass suicide. It's a journey that began decades earlier. A slow and steady descent into a world of increasingly bizarre and ultimately fatal beliefs.
That's what we're going to explore today. We're diving deep into the world of Heaven's Gate, using the Spanish Wikipedia article as our guide to understand how a group fascinated by science fiction and spirituality could end up so tragically.
And it all starts in 1975 with two seemingly ordinary individuals, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles.
Yeah, two people who met in a psychiatric hospital, no less. I mean, what are the odds? Talk about a meeting of the minds.
It was a meeting that would have profound consequences. They believed they were chosen to guide humanity to a higher level of existence, what they called the next level.
Okay, next level.
Yeah.
What did that actually mean to them? Was it like a literal place, state of being?
Think of it as emerging with a higher extraterrestrial intelligence, a way to transcend the limitations of our earthly bodies. This wasn't heaven in the traditional sense, but a new evolutionary step facilitated by alien contact.
So they were drawing on the ancient astronaut theory, the idea that aliens visited Earth in the past and influenced human development.
Exactly. Their belief system was a fascinating blend of science fiction. Think Star Trek with elements of Christianity and New Age philosophy, and they weren't shy about sharing it, actively seeking out crew members to join their cosmic journey.
Now, these early meetings, I've heard some wild stories. Is it true they initially called themselves Guinea and Pig?
They did. It might sound strange, but it reflects their view of humanity as being part of a grand cosmic experiment. Later, they adopted more biblical names, and eventually they settled on Bo and Peep, and then Do and Tai.
These constant name changes make it seem like they were trying to distance themselves from their earthly identities. Was it all about rejecting the material world from the get-go?
There was definitely an element of that. They believed that true salvation lay in detaching from earthly possessions and desires. The group adopted a nomadic lifestyle, living in camps, and even took on these unique two-syllable Odi names like Arkodi and Jimodi.
It's like they were creating their own language, their own world within a world. But did they completely reject the outside world at this point?
Not entirely. They initially emphasized no. The group's doctrine evolved over time. But even in these early days, there were signs of the control and manipulation that would later define Heaven's Gate.
I'm particularly curious about Applewhite. The Spanish Wikipedia article mentions a deep fear he harbored, a fear of being killed. Where did that stem from?
Well, Applewhite had a troubled past. He had spent time in prison and had been publicly scrutinized for his beliefs. This negative attention, coupled with his personal struggles, fueled a growing paranoia.
And how did that paranoia manifest within the group?
He began to see himself and the group as fulfilling biblical prophecies, specifically those relating to persecution and the end times.
So the outside world wasn't just something to be rejected, it became a threat, a force actively working against them.
And that's when things started to take a darker turn. To maintain control and discipline within the group, Applewhite implemented a series of games or rituals.
These weren't your average party games, were they? What was the purpose behind them?
These games were often bizarre and seemingly arbitrary, designed to test the members' obedience and break down their individuality.
So it was about instilling a sense of absolute loyalty to Applewhite and the group's ideology.
Precisely. The games were a tool for manipulation, a way to mold the members into unquestioning followers. But even with this growing control, the group would soon face a major upheaval: the death of Bonnie Nettles.
How did the group handle the loss of someone so central to their belief system?
That's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive into Heaven's Gate.
We left off with the death of Bonnie Nettles in 1985. This must have been a huge blow to the group, especially to Applewhite, who considered her his spiritual equal.
It was a pivotal moment, a turning point that would shape the group's trajectory towards their tragic end.
So how did Applewhite explain Nettles' death to the group? Did it shake their faith, or did he manage to weave it into their existing beliefs?
He claimed that she had ascended to the next level, that her physical body simply couldn't contain her powerful energy. It's fascinating how he used this event to solidify his own authority, positioning himself as the sole conduit to this higher plane of existence.
It's almost like he became a prophet, the only one who could interpret the signs and lead them to salvation.
And this shift in power was reflected in the group's evolving doctrine. Their focus on individual growth took a backseat, replaced by an emphasis on absolute obedience to Applewhite. Remember those games we discussed?
Yeah.
They became even more extreme, designed to completely break down the members' sense of self.
You have to wonder what was going through the minds of these people. Were they completely brainwashed at this point, or did they ever question Applewhite's teachings?
It's easy to judge in hindsight, but we have to remember that these were individuals searching for meaning and belonging. Applewhite offered them a sense of purpose, a community, and most importantly, an escape from a world that they increasingly saw as corrupt and doomed.
This reminds me of something you mentioned earlier, Applewhite's fear of the outside world. Did that fear intensify after Nettle's death?
Absolutely. He became even more paranoid, convinced that the government and other forces were conspiring against them.
And how did the group react to this paranoia? Did they share his fears?
They were increasingly isolated from the outside world, their only source of information being Applewhite and his increasingly distorted interpretations of reality.
So the stage is set for a complete withdrawal from society, a retreat into their own self-made world.
And their beliefs about the body take an even more extreme turn. Remember that analogy of the butterfly metamorphosis they used earlier? Well, it's no longer about individual transformation. The body becomes nothing more than a vessel, a temporary container for the soul that needs to be discarded to reach the next level.
This seems to be a significant shift, moving from the idea of spiritual growth to a more drastic, almost nihilistic view of the physical self. What influenced this change?
They were influenced by a concept popular in New Age circles at the time, the idea of walk-ins, where a higher being takes over a human body.
So they believed they could shed their earthly forms and become something entirely new, something alien.
Exactly. And this belief was further reinforced by their increasing suppression of sexuality. They adopted androgynous clothing and hairstyles, seeing any expression of individuality or desire as a distraction from their ultimate goal.
It's a level of detachment that's hard to fathom. But it gets even more extreme, doesn't it? The Spanish Wikipedia article mentions something about castration.
You're right. Applewhite and several other members underwent surgical castration as a way to completely eradicate any earthly desires and achieve a state of spiritual purity.
It's a chilling example of how far they were willing to go to escape their humanity.
And as their beliefs became more extreme, so did their isolation. They made attempts to reconnect with former members and even took out an ad in USA Today to spread their message. But these efforts were met with ridicule and rejection.
So their attempts to reach out only pushed them further into their own echo chamber, deepening their sense of alienation and persecution.
And that's when Hale-Bopp, a bright comet visible to the naked eye, appeared in the sky in 1997.
The comet that would become inextricably linked to their tragic fate. What was it about this celestial event that caught their attention?
Applewhite saw it as a sign, a signal that the time for their ascension to the next level had arrived. He believed that a spaceship was trailing behind the comet, and that the comet's tail was their ticket to this higher plane of existence.
It's almost unbelievable how he managed to fit a random celestial event into their already elaborate belief system.
But it was this belief, this absolute conviction that the time had come that would lead them to a secluded mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California, where they would carry out their final act.
And what happened inside that mansion?
That's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. Prepare yourself, because it's a story that will stay with you long after you hear it.
So we're here at the final chapter of this unsettling story. A secluded mansion in Rancho Santa Fe. A group of people utterly convinced their escape from a doomed Earth is imminent. It's a recipe for disaster, right?
It's hard to imagine what must have been going through their minds as they prepared for this so-called ascension. You know, these weren't unintelligent people.
Right.
They had lives, careers, families before they joined Heaven's Gate.
Right, so we've talked about their intelligence, their seeming normalcy. So how did they get to this point, to this absolute surrender to such an extreme belief system?
I think it's important to remember that their indoctrination was gradual. Many of them were members for decades. Their worldview was slowly molded through Applewhite's teachings, the group's rituals, and their isolation from any opposing viewpoints.
Like a slow drip of poison.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah.
You don't realize its effects until it's too late.
And within the group, there was this constant reinforcement of their beliefs. Doubts were discouraged. Questioning Applewhite was unthinkable. Their sense of purpose, their belonging, their very identity was tied to this belief system.
It's a classic cult tactic. creating an us versus them mentality, making the outside world seem threatening.
Exactly. And Applewhite was a master manipulator. He knew how to tap into people's fears, their desires for meaning and certainty.
And this comet, this hail bob, it became the ultimate symbol of both their salvation and their doom.
It was their ticket to the next level, their escape from the apocalypse they believed was coming.
So inside that mansion, what were their final days like?
They meticulously prepared for their departure, recording farewell messages, writing final letters, making sure their affairs were in order.
It's chilling to think about the level of conviction they must have had, truly believing they were leaving this world behind for something better.
And then on March 26, 1997, they carried out Applewhite's plan.
The mass suicide that shocked the world.
They ingested a lethal cocktail of phenobarbital mixed with applesauce and vodka, believing it would release their souls to the spaceship they thought was hidden behind Hale-Bopp.
39 people, all following one man's delusional vision.
Their bodies were found lying peacefully in bunk beds, dressed in those matching outfits, their faces covered with purple shrouds. It was a scene that sent shockwave through society, raising questions about faith, fanaticism, and the human need for belonging.
It's a tragedy on so many levels. The loss of life, the wasted potential, the utter devastation for their families and loved ones left behind.
The Heaven's Gate story is a stark reminder of the dangers of unquestioning belief and the power a charismatic leader can wield. It also forces us to look inward, to examine our own vulnerabilities to groupthink, and the allure of easy answers in a complex world.
This has been a truly disturbing and thought-provoking deep dive. It's a story that stays with you, that makes you question the very nature of belief and the fragility of the human psyche. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you in the next deep dive.